nearly made it through Chapter 7. The only little vodcast left has to do with directed political communication, and I have to admit they left a little bit of a whammy right for the end of this particular chapter, because directed political communication is not easy to understand. Therefore, I need you to listen very carefully when I say that, in a nutshell, directed political communication is the type of language that is determined by a political ideology. I want you to immediately think yourself into an example context. We have North Korea. We have former East Germany. Maybe we can even use certain Scandinavian countries. I want you to think of these contexts because they're somewhat different to yours. You're living in a capitalist, a democratic society. In North Korea, we have a communist society. In the Scandinavian countries, we have strong remnants of a socialist society. And where I grew up, in East Germany, we had a mix between socialism as well as communism. Why I'm bringing up these examples is it's easier for you to understand how directed political communication works. The definition here says, directed communication is definitely distorted communication, and it is restricted communication that is by its nature inhibiting full discussion of problems. Going back to North Korea, Kim Jong-un wants you to discuss certain things and not other things. The way he directs himself toward the public and he communicates toward the public is, of course, also very distorted and also very restricted, because what does he talk about? He talks about communism. He talks about how amazing his country is. He talks about his ideology and how everybody should buy into it. He doesn't talk about the West much. He doesn't talk about capitalism or other ideologies. So that's how communication is restricted. I grew up in East Germany, and in terms of a directed communication, I was, for example, not really allowed to talk about religion, because religion is a different belief to socialism. Religion didn't have any space in socialism. Therefore, the communication that we could apply, or the topics that we could discuss in East Germany, were restricted. I started off by telling you that ideology has an impact on political communication. So we need to understand what an ideology is. Very basically, it is, of course, a worldview. It's a perception of a reality. For example, if you're driving down the road in Sweden and there's a beggar on the side of the road, the Scandinavian ideology, which is a very socialist ideology, would say, "Ooh, this is horrible. We need to help this particular person. We need to make sure that the social netting will catch this particular person, and we can empower this person, and we can make sure that this person has exactly the same like everybody else." Whereas the view of an American driving past a beggar would be, "Well, survival of the fittest. I guess he didn't make it." Can you see? Because of their capitalist ideology, the Americans would read this particular situation very, very differently. So an ideology is a perception of reality. An ideology would also help us categorize things in the world. Just like I said with the beggar, completely different categorizations of the same event. So it helps us organize, it helps us perceive the world in a particular way. It is definitely a group phenomenon. Ideologies glue people together. They say here it's a cement-like material that keeps the group together. Lastly, and this is maybe a little bit hard for you to understand, an ideology is a secular belief. Now, this is a bit of an oxymoron, because secular means non-religious, and a belief usually is seen in the religious sphere. But basically what they're saying is, you, if you have an ideology, a political ideology, you will not really question that belief in this ideology, in this political ideology, just like you don't really question your religious beliefs. So it's a non-religious belief. Now that we understand what guides the restrictions and what guides the distortion of language, let's have a look at what this language, this directed political language, actually does. The language, on a deeper and in between the lines level, will indicate to members of a group what is harmful or what is useful. It also will indicate what is good and what is evil, what is just and what is unjust. And this language makes sure that you're constantly reproducing and constantly sharing a view in between group members. I know this is very abstract, so I'm going to try and make it a little bit easier. If you go onto page 134, it actually shows you how the language in South Africa has changed and how different contexts and different times had different political language that was restricted in different ways. For example, before 1989, there was no mentioning of movements and rebellion or any kind of group that would challenge the status quo. Whereas during the time of the reform or revolution, 89 to 94, all of a sudden words like non-racialism, undivided state, common fatherland started to pop up. So coming back to the first function, it says what is useful, indicates to members of a group what is useful. And what was useful for South Africa at that time was, for example, non-racialism, indicating what is good and what is evil. If you are looking on page 135, it says, from 1994 onward, the word Ubuntu was used a lot in the political sphere. And obviously that is something that is very useful or very good in the context of the new South Africa. Also, white racism, another phrase that was used past 1994, started to have this connotation of it being unjust and something that you should not do, something that is harmful to society. I hope through the use of these examples you have a little bit of a better idea of what directed political communication actually is. But please, feel free to go through the other shifting patterns and keywords and phrases in South Africa that you find on these pages. In a nutshell, words are powerful. Words as symbols carry to the outside what you believe. And politicians understand the power of words. And therefore they try and mold the language. They're trying to restrict the language. They're trying to manipulate the language because they know that language can serve them. And that's exactly what you see here. Political language functions to disseminate information, to set agendas and frames, to interpret and to relate events, to legitimize and delegitimize actions. Just think of Julius Malema trying to legitimize the action of violence toward white people. Yeah? He uses very strong and very directed and very emotional language in order to bring that about. And of course, directed political language can also stimulate action. I want to finish off with one particular example of directed political language, which has to do with the war on terror. After 9/11, the United States coined that phrase in order to adjust people to the idea of having to have military strikes against Afghanistan and other countries. And the phrase, the war on terror, made people feel differently about these military strikes. They actually made people see the necessity of these strikes. Obviously, there might not have been a necessity, but the politicians thought there was, and therefore they wanted to plant this idea. And they had really good publicists who actually came up with these phrases that would have a strong emotional reaction from the group so that they all keep on buying into the ideology of the United States. I hope you found this useful. I know this is not an easy section of the work, so make sure that you are listening to it carefully and make sure that you're revising it in your book as well. I'll see you for the next chapter.